1910 to 1931. In the dependent empire, especially in tropical Africa, north of the Zambezi River, the Rhodes-Milner Group was able to achieve most of its desires, but was unable to win wide publicity for them, especially for its views on native questions. It dominated the colonial office in London, at least for the decade 1919 to 1929. There, Milner was Secretary of State in 1919 to 1921 and Amory in 1924 to 1929, while the post of Parliamentary Undersecretary was held by the three members of the group for most of the decade. Publicity for their views on civilizing the natives and training them for eventual self-government received wide dissemination, not only by official sources, but also by the academic, scholarly, and journalistic organizations they dominated. As examples of this, we might mention the writings of Copeland, Haley, Curtis, Grigg, Amory, and Lothian, all roundtablers. In 1938, Lord Haley edited a gigantic volume of 1,837 pages called An African Survey. This work was first suggested by Smuts at Rhodes's house, Oxford, in 1929, had a foreword by Lothian, and an editorial board of Lothian, Haley, Copeland, Curtis, and others. It remains the greatest single book on modern Africa. These people and others, through the Times, the Round Table, the Observer, Chatham House, and other conduits, became the chief sources of ideas on colonial problems in the English-speaking world. Nevertheless, they were unable to achieve their program. In the course of the 1920s, the Round Table program for East Africa was paralyzed by a debate on the priority which should be given to the three aspects of the group's project for a Negro dominion north of the Zambezi. The three parts were 1. Native rights, 2. Closer union, and 3. International trusteeship. Generally, the group gave priority to closer union, federation of Kenya with Uganda and Tanganyika, but the ambiguity of their ideas on native rights made it possible for Dr. Joseph H. Oldham, spokesman for the organized nonconformist missionary groups, to organize a successful opposition movement to Federation of East Africa. In this effort, Oldham found a powerful ally in Lord Lugard, and considerable support from other informed persons, including Margery Perham. The Roundtablers, who had no first-hand knowledge of native life or even of tropical Africa, were devoted supporters of the English way of life, and could see no greater benefit conferred on natives than to help them to move in that direction. This, however, would inevitably destroy the tribal organization of life, as well as the native systems of land tenure, which were generally based on tribal holding of land. The white settlers were eager to see these things disappear, since they generally wished to bring the native labor force in African lands into the commercial market. Oldham and Lugard opposed this, since they felt it would lead to white ownership of large tracts of land on which detribalized and demoralized natives would subsist as wage slaves. Moreover, to Lugard, economy and colonial administration required that natives be governed under his system of, quote, indirect rule, unquote, through tribal chiefs. Closer union became a controversial target in this dispute because it involved a gradual increase in local self-government, which would lead to a greater degree of white settler rule. The opposition to closer union in East Africa was successful in holding up this project in spite of the Round Table domination of the colonial office, chiefly because of Prime Minister Baldwin's refusal to move quickly. This delayed change until the Labor government took over in 1929. In this, the pro-native nonconformists, especially Quaker influence, was stronger. The trusteeship issue came into this controversy because Britain was bound, as a mandate power, to maintain native rights in Tanganyika to the satisfaction of the Mandates Commission of the League of Nations. This placed a major obstacle in the path of Round Table efforts to join Tanganyika with Kenya and Uganda into a Negro dominion, which would be under quite a different kind of trusteeship of the African colonial powers. Farther south, in the Rhodesia and Nyasaland, the Round Table obsession with federation did not meet this obstacle, and that area was eventually federated, over native protests in 1953. But this creation, the Central African Federation, broke up again in 1964. Strangely enough, The League of Nations mandate system, which became such an obstacle to the Round Table plans, was largely a creation of the Round Table itself. The Milner Group used the defeat of Germany in 1918 as an opportunity to impose an international obligation on certain powers to treat the natives fairly in the regions taken from Germany. This opportunity was of great significance because just at that time, the early impetus in this direction arising from missionaries was beginning to weaken as a consequence of the general weakening of religious feeling in European culture. The chief problem in East Africa arose from the position of the white settlers of Kenya. Although this colony rests directly on the equator, its interior highlands, 4,000 to 10,000 feet up, were well adapted to white settlement and to European agricultural methods. The situation was dangerous by 1920 and grew steadily worse as the years passed, until by 1950, Kenya had the most critical native problem in Africa. It differed from South Africa in that it lacked self-government, rich mines, or a divided white population, but it had many common problems such as overcrowded native reserves, soil erosion, and discontented and detribalized blacks working for low wages on lands owned by whites. It had about 2 million blacks and only 3,000 whites in 1910. 40 years later, it had about 4 million blacks, 100,000 Indians, 24,000 Arabs, and only 30,000 whites, of which 40% were government employees. But what the whites lacked in numbers, they made up in determination. The healthful highlands were reserved for white ownership as early as 1908, although they were not delimited and guaranteed until 1939. They were organized as very large, mostly undeveloped farms, of which there were only 2,000 covering 10,000 square miles in 1940. Many of these farms were of more than 30,000 acres and had been obtained from the government, either by purchase or by very long, 999-year leases for only nominal costs, rents about 2 cents per year per acre. The native reserves amounted to about 50,000 square miles of generally poorer land, or 5 times as much land for the blacks, although they had at least 150 times as many people. The Indians, chiefly in commerce and crafts, were so industrious that they gradually came to own most of the commercial areas, both in the towns and in the native reserves. The two great subjects of controversy in Kenya were concerned with the supply of labor and the problem of self-government, although less agitated problems like agricultural technology, sanitation, and education were of vital significance. The whites tried to increase the pressure on natives to work on white farms rather than to seek to make a living on their own lands within the reserves, by forcing them to pay taxes in cash, by curtailing the size or quality of the reserves, by restricting improvements in native agricultural techniques, and by personal and political pressure and compulsion. The effort to use political compulsion reached a peak in 1919 and was stopped by Milner, although his group, like Rhodes in South Africa, was eager to make natives more industrious and more ambitious by any kinds of social, educational, or economic pressures. The settlers encouraged natives to live off the reserves in various ways, for example, by permitting them to settle as squatters on white estates in return for at least 180 days of work a year at the usual low-wage rates. To help both black and white farmers, not only in Kenya, but throughout the world, Milner created, as a research organization, an Imperial College of Tropical Agriculture at Trinidad in 1919. As a consequence of various pressures which we have mentioned, notably the need to pay taxes, which averaged perhaps 1 month's wages a year and, in the aggregate, took from the natives a larger sum than that realized from the sale of native products, the percentage of adult males working off the reservations increased from about 35% in 1925 to over 80% in 1940. This had very deleterious effects on tribal life, family life, native morality, and family discipline, although it seems to have had beneficial effects on native health and general education. The real crux of controversy before the Mau Mau uprising in 1948 to 1955 was the problem of self-government. Pointing to South Africa, the settlers in Kenya demanded self-rule, which would allow them to enforce restrictions on non-whites. A local colonial government was organized under the Colonial Office in 1906. As was usual in such cases, it consisted of an appointive governor, assisted by an appointed executive council, and advised by a legislative council. The latter had, also as usual, a majority of officials, and a minority of unofficial outsiders. Only in 1922 did the unofficial portion become elective, and only in 1949 did it become a majority of the whole body. The efforts to establish an elective element in the Legislative Council in 1919 to 1923 resulted in violent controversy. The draft drawn by the Council itself provided for only European members elected by a European electorate. Milner added 2 Indian members elected by a separate Indian electorate. In the resulting controversy, the settlers sought to obtain their original plan, while London sought a single electoral roll restricted in size by educational and property qualifications, but without mention of race. To resist this, the settlers organized a vigilance committee and planned to seize the colony, abduct the governor, and form a republic federated in some way with South Africa. From this controversy came eventually a compromise, the famous Kenya White Paper of 1923, and the appointment of Sir Edward Grigg as governor for the period of 1925 to 1931. The compromise gave Kenya a legislative council containing representatives of the imperial government, the white settlers, the Indians, the Arabs, and a white missionary to represent the blacks. Except for the settlers and Indians, most of these were nominated rather than elected. But by 1949, as the membership was enlarged, election was extended, and only the official and Negro members, 4 out of 41, were nominated. The Kenya White Paper of 1923 arose from a specific problem in a single colony, but remained the formal statement of imperial policy in tropical Africa. It said, quote, "Primarily Kenya is an African territory, and His Majesty's government think it necessary, definitely, to record their considered opinion that the interests of the African natives must be paramount, and that if and when those interests and the interests of the immigrant races should conflict, the former should prevail. In the administration of Kenya, His Majesty's government regard themselves as exercising a trust on behalf of the African population, and they are unable to delegate or share this trust, the object of which may be defined as the protection and advancement of the native races." End quote. As a result of these troubles in Kenya and the continued encroachment of white settlers on native reserves, Amory sent one of the most important members of Milner's group to the colony as governor and commander-in-chief. This was Sir Edward Grigg, Lord Altrincham, who had been a member of Milner's kindergarten, an editor of The Round Table and of The Times, 1903 to 1905, 1908 to 1913 respectively, as secretary to Lloyd George and to the Rhodes Trustees, 1923 to 1925, and a prolific writer on British imperial, colonial, and foreign affairs. In Kenya, he tried to protect native reserves while still forcing natives to develop habits of industry by steady work, to shift white attention from political to technical problems such as agriculture, and to work toward a consolidation of tropical Africa into a single territorial unit. He forced through the colonial legislature in 1930 the Native Land Trust Ordinance, which guaranteed native reserves, but these reserves remained inadequate and were increasingly damaged by bad agricultural practices. Only in 1925 did any sustained effort to improve such practices by natives begin. About the same time, efforts were made to extend the use of native courts, native advisory councils, and to train natives for an administrative service. All of these met slow, varied, and on the whole indifferent success, chiefly because of natives' reluctance to cooperate and the natives' growing suspicion of white men's motives, even when these whites were most eager to help. The chief cause of this growing suspicion, which in some cases reached a psychotic level, would seem to be the natives' insatiable hunger for religion and his conviction that the whites were hypocrites who taught a religion that they did not obey, were traitors to Christ's teachings, and were using these to control the natives and to betray their interests under cover of religious ideas which the whites themselves did not observe in practice.